What is going on, guys? Welcome to another market update. So let's get straight to the charts. As predicted in my last market update on the Quantonomy channel, we ended up creating a bit of a correction here due to a wide range of factors, from having so many green weekly candles in a row to being far away from key moving averages. I said that I would not be surprised if we got a correction taking us to the high 90 to low 100k area, and this is exactly what we've been doing so far. As of right now, we hit 103k. As stated before, it is very common to have quite significant dumps after golden crosses due to them being seldom news events. Bitcoin also loves repeating the symmetrical triangle breakout pattern, which I pointed out a while ago in our Telegram channel before this breakout even happened. I wouldn't call it a fake out because the triangle played out according to its measured move, which is taken from its widest point. The same thing happened over here. Instead, it is more of an initial upthrust, proving that the once ironclad resistance is not so invincible after all. After that, there is typically a sharp pullback in order to gather energy for the exit velocity needed to take us to new highs. You often even see the decline taking the price down to levels below the symmetrical triangle, which means that you should not panic if this is what we'll also see this time. Before continuing with my thoughts, let's look at some other important indicators and data, starting with the DXY. So, what has happened over here recently? Well, everything is going according to plan. We had our first dead cat bounce over here, which brought us right to this previous support zone, which has now turned into resistance. Then we got a rejection off of it, and then we had another small bounce, which rejected off of the previous bottom. Classic support turning into resistance. Hopefully, we will soon take out this low here as well. Then, by the end of the year, it's very, very likely that we will end up retesting areas like this over here. Now, let's look at the unemployment rate. So, the good thing here is that we haven't really been going up lately. Instead, we have been ranging sideways from this 4% area to the 4.3% area. And let's hope this can continue for the foreseeable future, because if this were to go above the 5% line, then this could signal a potential recession. But right now, we have plenty of room left to delay this for as long as possible so we can have our Bitcoin mania phase. As you can see, by the end of the year, we will still most likely enter this area, unless we have some kind of different situation, some very rare exception. Now, let's look at the federal funds rate. So the good thing here is that we have been stabilizing here as well. As you can see, the Fed hasn't really cut the rates any lower recently. And when you look at the next Fed meeting, which will likely happen sometime in mid-June, 18th of June, the current probability is a 99% chance of not having any change to the interest rate, which is very good news for us. Because when we go back to the chart and look at this, it's undeniable. The pattern is clear. When the Fed usually starts cutting rates aggressively, that's when we also have a recession. So what we want to do here is something similar to this, where we are delaying the inevitable for as long as possible. When looking at the crypto fear and greed index, it's very good that we had a nice little correction here recently. We went all the way from 74 to the 50 area over here. Currently, we're at 64. So this is also pretty good news. We are resetting the fear and greed index so we don't get ahead of ourselves. But anyway, it's pretty normal for the mania phase to be in the 90s for quite a significant period of time, so we shouldn't be too surprised when that happens soon as well. When looking at Google Trends, things are still looking abysmal here, which actually is very good news, because that means that the mainstream just doesn't care about Bitcoin right now, because they don't believe that we will go to these ridiculous levels that we're envisioning for the next 6 months or so. Right now is the time to accumulate. Come on, we recently even took out the all-time high, and this is still down all the way at these ridiculous levels over here. And when we will reach the mania phase, that's when we will see these ridiculous levels of 75 and 100 over here. But that's when the whales will dump on retail. Now let's look at some news. First up, we have more institutional adoption by governments and banks. We now have Pakistan revealing plans to establish a national Bitcoin reserve, aiming to diversify its financial assets amid economic challenges. The initiative, announced at the Bitcoin 2025 conference in Las Vegas, positions Pakistan as one of the first Asian nations to explore state-backed Bitcoin adoption. Bilal bin Saqib, head of Pakistan's Crypto Council, said that today is a very historic day. Today, I announced the Pakistani government is setting up its own government-led Bitcoin strategic reserve, and we want to thank the United States of America again because we were inspired by them. What have we been telling you guys? The boldest countries and institutions who want to stay ahead of the curve are starting to gather reserves now that Bitcoin is still relatively cheap compared to the potential future valuations of millions of dollars per Bitcoin. Even authoritarian countries like Russia are now launching structured bonds that track the price of Bitcoin and the dollar to ruble exchange rate. I guess Russia opening up to crypto in general is their attempt to stabilize their shaky economy and currency by being less influenced by the dollar. Pretty interesting how different their stance is compared to their Chinese friends. I guess China is still under the illusion that they can stop Bitcoin in order to retain even more control over their people. This brings us to our next topic. Namely, Silk Road's Ross Ulbricht gave a speech during the Las Vegas Bitcoin conference. It feels almost like yesterday when he gave his previous speech at the last Bitcoin conference, for which he was apparently put into solitary confinement. Ross was incredibly lucky to be pardoned because he's famous enough and seen as a man of the people in the Bitcoin community. Therefore, Trump attempted to curry favor with Bitcoiners and gain a certain part of this aura. Anyway, Ross talked about a lot of things such as seeing new tech inventions like AI and drones for the first time in his life. More importantly, he gave a fascinating speech about his exploits against some wasp nests that were bothering him while he was trying to grow some, let's just say, controversial fungi. I want you guys to listen to the most important parts of the speech. Feel free to skip ahead if you're not interested in it, but I think it's well worth a listen.
But when I showed up at the cabin, I found that there were 7 wasp nests tucked in all the corners of the front porch, with one big one hanging right over the front door. There were wasps everywhere. They were swarming in the air and crawling all over the nests. The cabin was totally uninhabitable, and the wasp infestation needed to be taken care of. But I didn't want to call an exterminator or involve my landlord, for obvious reasons. So I was on my own. But I remembered a trick that my father had shown me when I was a kid for removing wasps. What he did was he got a towel and spread it out in his hands, and he got as close as he could to the wasp nest. And then at the last moment, he darted out, wrapped it up, and cinched the towel closed. The wasps couldn't sting him through the towel, and they couldn't get out. So incredibly, it worked. So there I was, on the wasp-infested porch. My heart was pounding as I prepared to do what I'd seen my dad do. Like many things I've done in my life, I wouldn't try this one at home. So I selected the nest that was furthest from the others because I didn't know if the other nests would come to their aid and sting me. Spread out the towel, got as close as I could, ready to flee if I had to. But when I wrapped up the nest, nothing happened. It was as if the other wasps didn't even notice. So I was able to go around the porch and carefully remove each wasp nest one by one until there were no more wasps, not even the big nest over the front door. So, why did I tell you this story? Let's look at what made the wasps strong and what made them weak. And remember, freedom, decentralization, unity. The wasps were strong because they were free. Each wasp could act independently, and it was impossible to keep track of so many individual wasps. The sting could come from any direction. Freedom is our strength as well. In prison, my every move was monitored and controlled. I was constantly dominated by the system I was trapped in. I had no freedom, and that made me weak. But with freedom, we have choices. And with choices, we become unpredictable, just like the wasps. Choice is the essence of freedom. Any one of us could create the next piece of liberating technology that empowers the people of the world. And compared to the constraints I lived under in prison, there's very little standing in our way. Bitcoin doesn't work without freedom. Bitcoin's power comes from the fact that any one of us can mine if we choose to. Any one of us can generate addresses if we choose to. Any one of us can send Bitcoins to anyone else. We are all on equal footing with Bitcoin. With Bitcoin, we are all free.
So, this really sums up one of the main reasons why many of us loved Bitcoin in the first place, aside from it being a great investment, of course. Governments should have as little control over the lives of people as possible, and freedom to transact and store the fruits of your labor without being robbed through inflation should be basic human rights in this day and age. It is great that some governments are now acknowledging this. This brings us to our next topic, namely the famous YouTuber CoffeeZilla made a video pretty critical of the Bitcoin conference, the potential viability of Bitcoin as an investment, now that governments are already buying it, and the general attitude of people wanting institutions and governments to pump their bags. While I agree with some of the points, especially the reality expressed by this meme, it appears to me that CoffeeZilla shares a pretty common misconception of Bitcoin being the same thing as crypto. Look, I really like CoffeeZilla's content. He has done a great service to the community by exposing various scams, etc. But everybody has their blind spot. I just found it baffling that somebody with expertise and knowledge of this space after years of research still misunderstands Bitcoin itself, as evidenced by his moderate distrust toward it. While it is true that we want Bitcoin to remain as the money of the people, governments and institutions buying it up is just a completely unavoidable eventuality as the network grows. That's the thing when you have censorship resistant money. Everybody can use it, even people and institutions you don't like. Now that we have already arrived at this point, you might as well hope for your country to be among the first to adopt it, to allow your fellow citizens to reap the rewards. Everything is good as long as people and not the government retain control over the network's consensus mechanisms. If anything, institutional adoption further legitimizes Bitcoin. While I definitely agree that Bitcoin is no longer in the earliest stages of adoption, there is still plenty of growth left for it for decades to come. Pumping our bags is just one of our more superficial desires. We also want better monetary technology that allows us to save our life's work without getting it forcefully debased by a fraudulent system or taken from us if we don't agree with certain political positions. It is one of several technologies allowing us to gain more freedom over our lives, as Ross Ulbricht said. Now, back to the charts, starting with the M2 money shift. Everything is still looking very good over here. You can see that Bitcoin is finally catching up to the money supply, and the money supply itself is still moving to the upside. So there are no warning signs over here as of right now. Now let's look at the S&P compared to Bitcoin. Wow, things are looking quite interesting over here, because for the first time in a very long time, we can see that the S&P is actually outperforming Bitcoin because Bitcoin is dumping while the S&P is trying to put in new highs over here. The only warning sign here is that the S&P actually has a gap over here. You cannot see it in this chart. So that could be a potential area to retest. But as of right now, the S&P is looking quite strong. The important thing is that when Bitcoin recovers again, that it will move in unison with the S&P again, because that will show that we're back in a risk-on environment. Now back to Bitcoin. When looking at Bitcoin using the line chart instead of the candlestick chart, things look more reassuring to the bulls. We stayed quite a bit above previous resistance on a close basis, and we're now just coming back down to retest the previous resistance area as potential support, even if we were to drop a bit lower here, because we're really talking about a range here instead of a specific level. On a shorter term scale, we're finding some temporary resistance off of our uppermost resistance zone, as you can see over here. The resistance zone also lines up with our short-term 20-day moving average, indicating the first real correction since our bottom all the way down at 74K. The remaining cluster of daily moving averages remains in the 90 to 100K region, so a possible retest of one or some of these moving averages would line up perfectly with some of these targets we discussed before. When looking at the weekly moving averages, you can see that there is really nothing to worry about so far. We're well above even the 20-week moving average. And while it is possible, I don't even think we will end up retesting it, akin to this example over here. In order to avoid the feared double top scenario of 2021, we just need to continue having a controlled descent over here. And what would this potential controlled descent form? A beautiful macro bull flag designed to launch us into space toward our moon target of this cycle. In other words, I think we're just having this final correction of the stereotypical bubble cycle before launching toward optimism, belief, thrill, and euphoria. All of these stages will likely happen in rapid succession over the course of the next half a year or so hold on to your hats. This is Saverio speaking, and as always, thanks for watching.